All right, so let's dive right in.
Yeah.
You sent over some interesting stuff about Apple stock, and we're going to take a deep dive into it today.
Sounds good.
You're thinking about maybe picking up some shares before their earnings report, which is coming out on January 30th.
Right.
And you want to make sure you're making a smart move here. So we're going to break down this Motley Fool article that caught your attention.
Okay.
It brings up some really interesting points about how Apple's been performing lately, where they stand in terms of valuation, and even what Warren Buffett's been up to with his Apple holdings.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting stuff. What really stood out to me was how Apple's this massive company, right? I mean, they brought in a whopping $391 billion in revenue in fiscal 2024.
Yeah, that's a huge number.
It is. But here's the thing. Their growth has kind of stalled since the end of 2022.
Really?
Yeah, it's kind of strange. Their stock price keeps going up, but their revenue growth isn't exactly setting the world on fire.
That is interesting, and the Motley Fool article actually delves into that a bit. They're saying that a big part of it is their product segment. iPhones and all the other hardware they sell.
Uh-huh.
They're just not seeing the same kind of growth they used to.
Makes sense.
They point to a couple of things.
Yeah.
One is that people are holding onto their devices longer, so those upgrade cycles are getting longer.
Yeah.
And also, the competition is heating up, especially in places like China.
Right.
What do you think about that?
Well, I think it shows how important it is for Apple to adapt. I mean, their success has been built on the iPhone, but the smartphone market's not what it used to be. People aren't upgrading as often, and their rivals, especially in big markets like China, are really stepping up their game.
So they've got to find new ways to grow if they want to justify their current valuation.
Exactly.
It's like they're at this crossroads where they need to figure out their next big move.
Uh-huh.
But the article does mention one bright spot, right? Their services revenue, things like subscriptions and App Store sales.
Yeah.
That's actually doing pretty well.
Oh, yeah. That's actually really interesting. That whole services segment, it's high margin, which means they make a lot of profit from every dollar they earn, and it could be key to making up for those slowdown in hardware sales.
So it's like a strategic shift for them.
Absolutely.
Wow.
And it's already contributing a lot to their bottom line. Remember, their operating income was $123 billion.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive.
It is. So you've got this situation where they're old, reliable, the iPhone is facing some headwinds, but their services are picking up the slack.
And that brings us to the whole question of their valuation.
Yeah.
Because even though their revenue growth is stalled, Apple's stock is up over 200% in the past 5 years. It's even outperformed the S&P 500.
Yeah.
How do we make sense of that?
Well, it all comes down to how the market is valuing Apple right now. The Motley Fool article talks about their price-to-earnings ratio, or PE ratio. It's gone from 24 to 38 in the last 5 years.
So what does that mean exactly?
Basically, it means investors are willing to pay a lot more for each dollar of Apple's earnings than they were before.
So even though their growth has slowed down, the market seems to have a lot of faith in their future.
Yeah, that's right. But here's where things get really interesting. The article mentions that Warren Buffett, who's Apple's biggest shareholder outside of index funds, has been selling a good chunk of his Apple stock.
Wow. And Warren Buffett isn't exactly known for making rash decisions, is he?
No, not at all. He's considered one of the smartest investors out there. So his decision to reduce his Apple holdings definitely makes you wonder.
It's like he's sending a message.
It could be. Could it be connected to this rising PE ratio we were talking about?
Maybe. The Motley Fool seems to think that Buffett might be worried about Apple's valuation, especially with their growth prospects looking a bit shaky in the near term.
That makes sense. He's a value investor at heart. He looks for companies that are undervalued by the market, so maybe he's seeing better opportunities elsewhere?
So we've got this really interesting situation. Apple's growth isn't what it used to be, but the market seems to be betting on a brighter future, while one of their biggest supporters, Warren Buffett, is starting to back away. What does the Motley Fool article say about all of this? What's their take on Apple's future prospects?
Well, to be honest, they're pretty skeptical about Apple's ability to keep things going the way they have been. They point out some of the company's recent missteps and the challenges they're facing.
Okay, now I'm really curious. What are they specifically pointing to?
Well, they bring up the Vision Pro launch. You know, it was supposed to be this revolutionary product,
Right.
but it kind of flopped. It didn't really meet expectations.
Well, wow.
And they also point out that Apple seems to be falling behind in the AI race, which is a big deal these days.
Yeah, that's true.
And while things like the Apple Watch and AirPods are doing okay, they're not bringing in enough money to make a huge difference for a company as big as Apple.
It sounds like they're saying Apple's having trouble finding that next big thing, that spark that'll really push them forward.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. Makes you wonder if maybe they've lost some of their innovative edge.
That's a really interesting thought.
Mm.
And it's something a lot of analysts are talking about.
Mm.
But the Motley Fool does acknowledge that Apple has some big strengths.
Right.
Like their brand loyalty is incredible.
Yeah.
And they're still making a ton of money.
Yeah, that's true.
But they question whether those things alone are enough to justify their current valuation, which is pretty sky high.
They're basically saying Apple's a great company, but are they really that great?
Right. Are their strengths enough to outweigh the challenges they're facing?
Exactly. And they ultimately conclude that while Apple is a fantastic company, their current valuation might not be sustainable if their growth doesn't pick back up.
So we've got this picture of Apple at a bit of a crossroads, facing new challenges in a tech world that's changing all the time. It makes their upcoming earnings report even more important, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely. This report could give us a much better idea of whether Apple can tackle these challenges and get back on track.
Or if their best days are behind them.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, let's go back to that question we asked earlier. If you were Warren Buffett looking at all of this, what would you do with Apple stock? Buy, hold, or sell?
That's a good one. It's a tough call. Let's break it down and think about each option.
Okay, so let's start with buy. What would make you want to buy more Apple stock right now?
Well, if you were feeling bullish on Apple, you'd have to believe that this slowdown is just temporary. You know, maybe you think they'll figure out the whole AI thing.
Yeah.
Or that they've got some amazing new product up their sleeve that we don't know about yet.
So you're betting on them still having a lot of room to grow.
Right, and that their current valuation is fair.
Okay, makes sense. What about hold?
Hold means you're taking a wait-and-see approach. You know, things aren't looking amazing right now, but you're not ready to give up on Apple just yet. You still believe in them, and you're willing to stick it out and see what happens.
So you're not panicking, but you're not exactly doubling down either.
Exactly. Sometimes the best thing to do is just wait and see how things play out.
Right. All right, and lastly, let's talk about sell. What would make someone want to sell their Apple stock at this point?
If you were selling, it would mean you think Apple's best days are over. You might be worried about their slowing growth or the fact that they don't seem to have a clear path to future growth.
And maybe you'd rather invest in companies that you think have a brighter future.
Exactly. It's all about managing risk and reward.
That's so true. This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. We've covered so much.
We have, from Apple's financials and valuation to Warren Buffett's moves. It's a lot to take in.
And we've explored different viewpoints on Apple's future. So you've got a lot to think about as you make your decision.
Definitely. But remember, this is just one perspective based on that Motley Fool article.
Right. There are always other viewpoints out there.
Always.
And the decision of whether to buy, hold, or sell is ultimately up to you.
That's right. It's your money and your investment.
So do your research. Think about your financial goals and make the choice that feels right for you. And hey, we'd love to hear what you decide. So feel free to share your thoughts with us on social media.
Yeah, definitely.
We always like to hear from our listeners. But as we wrap up this deep dive on Apple, I want to leave you with one more thought. We've been talking a lot about Apple specifically.
Right.
But let's step back for a second and think about the bigger picture. You know, the whole tech industry.
That's a good point. Apple isn't operating in a vacuum. They're part of this constantly changing tech landscape.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's so many things happening right now that could have a big impact on Apple's future.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, think about the rise of AI.
Uh-huh.
All the buzz around the metaverse.
Yeah.
The growing importance of data privacy.
Right.
And all the increased scrutiny that big tech companies are facing from regulators.
It's a lot to keep track of.
It really is.
Yeah.
And all these things could really shake things up for Apple.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the technology itself. It's about understanding how people are using technology and how that's changing.
Yeah. How is consumer behavior evolving?
Right. What will people want from technology in the years to come?
What will their priorities be?
These are the kind of questions that investors need to be thinking about.
Because the answers could have a huge impact on companies like Apple.
Exactly.
Now, obviously, we can't predict the future.
If only.
But it's important to be aware of these trends and how they might affect Apple's path forward.
I agree. It's not enough to just look at the numbers. You have to understand what's driving those numbers.
So don't get caught up in the headlines, you know, the latest earnings report or product launch.
Right.
Try to take a longer view.
What are the long-term trends that are going to shape the tech industry over the next decade or two?
Because those are the trends that will determine whether Apple can stay on top.
Exactly. The tech world is constantly evolving. What works today might not work tomorrow.
And Apple's success will depend on their ability to adapt to those changes.
Absolutely.
So as you're thinking about whether to buy, hold, or sell Apple stock, remember that this deep dive is just a starting point.
Keep researching.
Explore different perspectives.
Talk to other investors.
And trust your gut.
Investing is a journey, and you learn something new with every decision.
That's a great way to put it. Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive into Apple stock.
Hope you found it helpful.
We sure did. Until next time, happy investing.